Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to call to order the April 18th, 2024 Finance Subcommittee of the City of Pinole. And first item on the agenda is, well, should we do roll call for the record?
Mayor Toms.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Sasai.
Here.
Treasurer Swearingen.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Item number 2 on the agenda is public comment, and this is for items not on the agenda. Are there any speakers? And I don't see any in Zoom land.
No speakers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda is the consent calendar, and we have the minutes from April 14th, 2022. Is there a motion?
So move to accept. Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, that motion passes. We have business items. Are there any changes to the order of the agenda?
I think we were going to see how the time goes, and then we'll check in for the second item.
Okay.
I can let you know. We may have a change to switch items B and C.
Okay, great. Well, we'll move to item A, and this is the Strategic Financial Planning Report.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, City Treasurer, staff, and members of the public. For this item, we have our consultants of Baker Tilly here with us this afternoon to present a report on the strategic financial planning support that Baker Tilly has provided the city in an effort to assist us with developing a more robust and prescriptive long-term financial plan. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Andy and Steve, and they are joining us remotely.
Thank you, Markeisha. I'm Andy Belknap with Baker Tilly, and I'm here with Steve Montano, also with Baker Tilly. And we will sort of trade off presenting this PowerPoint, which explains our fiscal modeling and basically our long-range sustainability plan for the city of Pinole. So I'll start it off. Could we have the next slide, please? This is our project team. Steve and I and Jessica were our project team. All of us have worked on a number of sustainability projects involving California cities. I've probably worked on 24 of these projects, and I'll introduce myself professionally and ask Steve to do that here just momentarily, but I have 20 years experience as a city manager, a finance director, and a public works director in 3 California cities and a California county, and then 15 years almost as a local government consultant. Steve, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Montana. I'm a special advisor with Baker Tilly. I have over 25 years experience in public sector finance, mostly all of it working for municipalities. Within the finance department, I was the deputy finance director for the city of Newport Beach for 9 years, and I was pretty much running the day-to-day shop, everything from revenue collections, budgeting, accounting. So we're very familiar with long-term forecasting and budgeting and fiscal sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, could we have the next slide, please? So in terms of the presentation we're going to make here today, we're going to talk about what we call our baseline forecast, which is sort of our forecast assuming things keep going the way they have been going. And it's intended to give us a picture of what things would look like if the city continued with sort of the status quo. And we're going to show you what that looks like. After we do that, we're going to sort of define the problem that is created by that baseline forecast and talk about what strategies exist for dealing with that, and how we develop strategies and assess their feasibility. And then we'll go into specific budget strategies and the analysis of those strategies and give some details around those strategies. What I have found in doing this work is there's no shortage of strategies. The biggest problem is there's always time urgency. And when you start thinking about this, you have the most time, but the time gradually goes away and you lose flexibility and you lose ability to do different strategies as you lose time. So one of the things to keep in mind when you're dealing with a structural deficit, which is what Pinole has, is that time is not your friend. And so the sooner you get started in dealing with the problems, the better off the community will be. Next slide. So again, we'll go over a little bit of about project overview, how we did this. We first set about identifying gaps between current conditions and desired conditions, or basically a balanced budget. And then we worked with city staff to develop strategies that could close gaps. And we worked with the city to develop a 20-year forecast that models the impacts of sustainability strategies as well as that baseline forecast that I mentioned. Next slide. So let's get into the baseline forecast. Next slide. So again, important assumptions. This assumes the continuation of the status quo, staffing levels, service levels, and programs, assumes no new revenues or expenditure reductions. It assumes average annual revenue and expenditure growth based on historical trends. And it does factor in economic cycles, i.e. recessions, which we know come along from time to time, generally about every 7 years, but lately that's been in a little bit of a state of flux. Hasn't been every 7 years, just recently. Next slide, please. This is what that baseline forecast looks like. And the baseline expenditure trend is shown in the red line, and the baseline revenue trend is shown in the black line. And as you can see, the red line is above the black line, which is not the way we want it. And so there is this gap, which is highlighted in blue, and that's the structural deficit. It's not huge on an annual basis, but cumulatively, it gets larger and larger. And, you know, it grows from about 1 million in 24-25, which again is not, given the size of your budget, is not giant, but then it gets to be pretty large in the out years. And so this can't be allowed to happen because it would exhaust the reserve funds. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like in terms of the fund balance forecast. And you can see that it basically goes negative and stays negative. And this would not be a sustainable situation for the city. And so This isn't going to happen because, you're not going to allow it to happen. It's just a hypothetical of what happens if the status quo continues and adjustments are not made. But what we know from practicing in this field is that adjustments get made. Again, though, the timeliness of those adjustments is important because the more timely you can be in terms of making adjustments, the better off and the less turbulence, I guess would be one word, is created when those adjustments are made. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over here to Steve, and Steve's going to talk a little bit about how we went about developing strategies. And what we did is first we talked about strategies a little bit in the abstract, and then we made them more real. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and he's going to talk about that.
Thank you, Andy. So in our modeling, in our long-term modeling, we developed 4 scenarios which consisted of various strategies. And these budget strategies were organized according to the 4 strategy types. So the first was revenue enhancements. These are strategies that maintain service levels by increasing all the resources, the revenues available to pay for the services through new or increased revenue. So this was very revenue-dependent strategy. And then a next category was expenditure controls cost shifts. This is where the scenario or the strategies really focus on maintaining service levels through reduction in expenditures or shifting the cost burden away from the general fund. So the focus there is not so much on the revenue, but on the expenditure side. Then there's this category of strategies that we call service delivery and governance changes. And this is where we maintain service levels by changing the way the services are delivered, maybe changing the way the city does business, either through fiscal governance practices, looking at best practices and identifying areas where the city could improve in its fiscal governance, and other things such as contracting for services or insourcing for services from other agencies. Those are other possibilities. And then finally, we looked at failing all of those, assuming that for whatever reason, the city can't, at least in the near term, start pursuing these strategies. There's always the least favorable strategy to pursue, and those are service level reductions. As I say here, if those don't yield sufficient fiscal savings, all the other previous strategies, the city would need to explore service level reduction strategies to achieve fiscal sustainability. So let's move on to the next slide. So strategies can be distinguished by differing levels of potential community support, complexity of implementation. There could be implementation timing issues, and the disruption to the organization relative to the financial return, because you also, that's one of the more important things is, okay, if you're going to pursue, say, a revenue measure, what is the potential revenue upside of that? If you're going to pursue some austerity measure that's going to reduce expenditures, well, at what cost? What's it going to cost, and what will be the impact to the community in terms of service levels, right? Those are all very important things to assess as you look at each strategy. So these strategies that we incorporated into the long-term fiscal forecast were developed on the best and most current information available to us. So we had to make some assumptions in order to model these strategies. Each strategy was qualitatively evaluated according to a set of criteria indicated in the table. It's kind of small font, but you see tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So tier 1 strategies tend to have the possibility of being implemented more readily, and they would likely be least disruptive to the organization and have a greater fiscal impact. So those are the ones we really want to pursue. Before we go to, say, tier 2, which are more moderate, and tier 3, which are strategies that have a lower likelihood of success due to their complexity or lack of community support, and maybe they just don't give you the bang for the buck, right? So there's just not that high level of fiscal return for pursuing those strategies. So that's what this graph on the left tries to depict is you really want to be in that upper right quadrant, tier 1, where you have high return, low difficulty. So that pretty much determines your likelihood of success when pursuing these strategies. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what we deemed tier 1 strategies. On the revenue enhancement side, we're listing sales tax add-on measure. The city's been successful in passing a sales tax measure previously. We list business license tax rate increases, real property transfer tax, increase on franchise fee rates and gross receipts. I know the city's interested in pursuing, especially as it has been talking about for a number of years now, on real property transfer tax. And as I say, it has been successful in pursuing sales tax increases as well. Okay, next slide, please. Here are the tier 2 strategies that, as I said before, are considered moderately feasible to implement. Generally, these will take more time to successfully implement and will be more disruptive to the city or community residents when you talk about service delivery impacts. Utility users tax, parcel tax. So within UUT, you might consider expanding your covered utilities or increase your existing rate, or both, right? There's the introduction of a parcel tax. Parcel tax is usually more common among school districts, but cities also have past practice of implementing a parcel tax. And there's the financing of capital assets, in particular streets and roads. We met with your public works director, and we got a really good sense of the condition of your streets and roads, which are generally poor and heading towards failing. So there was an option there that we researched as an option, financing maybe some streets and roads improvements. So the city may need to begin work on some of these strategies to the extent that, for whatever reason, maybe tier 1 strategies are not successful, or you don't pursue as many as you might need to fall back to tier 2. Next slide, please. So tier 3 strategies, as I said before, are considered the least feasible to implement. Generally, these strategies have proven difficult to implement and typically have sort of a negative impact on the organization and community, because we're talking about service levels, right? If you're going to do things like we've listed here under expenditure controls and cost shifts, like very targeted expenditure reductions, it'll be difficult to hire a new staff if you're going to be implementing things like retiree healthcare benefits, shifting medical contribution costs to employees, increasing pension contributions. I know it's difficult to recruit good people these days, and this would make it even more difficult. And then finally, worst case scenario would be, in taking no action, ultimately, the city would have to take action, right? It would force the city's hand to make very drastic and maybe uncontrolled and ungraceful expenditure reductions to avoid insolvency. Because there is a way, and I'll go through this later in the presentation, there are maybe tiered approaches to reducing expenditures. It doesn't have to be sort of the big bang method of cutting costs. There's a way to do that, and we'll go over that later. Next slide, please. So as I said before, we did prepare a series of 4 scenarios for the City Council's consideration to address the fiscal gap. Now, these budget scenarios are provided as examples of types of strategies. As I said before, I gave you kind of a flavor of the different types of strategies to achieve fiscal solvency. It was, I believe you received a written report that's quite lengthy. The strategies and their fiscal impacts are greatly detailed in attachment A of your staff report, so I highly encourage you to read that at some point. I won't go into all that detail in this presentation, but it talks at length about the strategies and the fiscal impacts. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about our first scenario. And this is your long-range forecast scenario. We call this the strong revenue strategy scenario, and it includes all the things you see here. all at once. Introduce a parcel tax, increase business license, get that financing for your street and road rehabilitation, additional 1/2 cent sales tax measure, excuse me, increasing franchise fees, increasing the UUT and expand to other utility areas, and then implementing the real property transfer tax. Now, next slide, please. Let's go over this. So, as Andy said before, let me explain the graph. There's lots of lines. Basically, in all of these graphs that we'll be sharing with you, black line over red line is good. That's what you want. You want baseline revenue, black line, over baseline expenditure, or intermittent black line, which is forecasted revenues, over intermittent red line, which is forecast expenditures. That's what you want to see, hopefully. Hopefully these strategies will get you closer to that. So in this scenario, the baseline and forecast revenues are the same. So there's really only one red line, and that makes sense, right? Because we're not really touching expenditures in this scenario. It's a strong revenue strategy scenario. So in this graph, we're comparing the future fiscal impact, with the exception of the bond financing. We didn't include that here because that's such a large amount, and that would require, a whole lot more policy discussion and decisions, and it would require sort of a municipal advisor to really give you more accurate estimates than we are. Although Baker Tilly has a municipal advisor arm, and I did seek their assistance in coming up with the estimates for the bond financing of streets rehabilitation. So that was used to inform what I say in attachment A. There's a lot of detail there about such a financing, but that's excluded from this because this is primarily general fund. And it does compare to baseline. So under this scenario, balanced budgets are achieved for most of the forecast period. And I do recognize that it isn't likely that the city would simultaneously implement all these strategies at once. That's quite a heavy lift, and that's not very realistic, but the example does demonstrate the significant revenue increases that would be necessary to balance the budget. It's just kind of an extreme example of what it would take, at least on the revenue side. If not in 1 year, over several years, it would probably take, if you only focused on revenues and didn't touch expenditures, this is what it would take. So for example, the city would need an additional $6 million to align the projected baseline revenues with projected baseline expenditures going out to fiscal year 2031. Again, it assumes no cost reduction strategies are implemented. Next slide, please. So this graph, much like the baseline that Andy showed you before, compared the fiscal impact to general fund balance if the strategies in scenario 1 are implemented. The black bars represent the forecast fund balance amounts, and the black line going down, heading south, represents your baseline fund balance. So, that's a much prettier picture, obviously. General fund would maintain a growing and somewhat stable fund balance for the forecast years, but without the implementation of scenario 1 or any cost reduction strategies, the general fund balance would be exhausted by fiscal year 28. And again, the city would experience sustained and growing deficits for the remainder of the forecast period. Again, that's the status quo that Andy showed you earlier. Next slide, please. So since we're talking about strong revenue measures, it's important, if you don't know already, that there is an initiative eligible for the November 24 statewide ballot that would limit the ability of local governments to raise revenues.
We should go back one slide. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't notice they were. So there is this new statewide ballot initiative going to the vote in November that would limit the ability of local governments to raise revenues by introducing stricter rules for raising taxes, fees, assessments, and other charges. It would revise state constitution for Props 13, 218, and 26. These are all the ones that spell out in modern times how California cities can raise revenue. These are sort of the rules of operations for revenue. So they would write it in such a way that really would constrict your ability even further. These kind of limit you over the past 3 decades. These things, well, 13's back from the 70s, but 218 and 26 have really put curbs around how cities raise revenues, and this ballot measure would put even further constraints. And then on the fines and penalty side, it would limit what local governments could assess in terms of implementing fair housing and other ordinances. So just to keep that in mind, that especially going forward, if this passes, you can't be too heavily reliant on revenue to sort of align your budget going forward. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about scenario 2. This is what we called our mixed approach. You have some moderate revenue increases with some cost shifts. So examples on the cost side would be increasing employee pension contributions, again, shifting the medical contribution cost to employees, reducing medical benefits for new hires. And now we're talking about, for the first time, we're talking about general fund expenditure reductions, $500,000 annually through fiscal year 30, just to get through that first hump of solving your immediate deficit problems, 500 off the top. And on the revenue side, increasing franchise fees, increasing UUT and expanding, as we discussed earlier, and then implementing the real property transfer tax. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so we incorporated everything that I just mentioned except the retiree health benefit strategy. We felt that further analysis was necessary to accurately project the reduction or elimination of those benefits for new hires, so we kind of excluded that. But everything else was incorporated. So again, the solid red line represents baseline expenditures and the solid black line is baseline revenues. The black intermittent line is forecast revenues and red intermittent line is forecast expenditure. So again, although it's not likely that the city would simultaneously implement all strategies at once, this we might need to take a tiered approach. Again, the example just provides an order of magnitude estimate for the implementation of these specific initiatives. So in this case, forecasted expenditures for scenario 2 closely align with baseline expenditures with no marked impact on the growth trajectory. So for the most part, both broken and solid red lines are the same, okay? Forecasted revenues under this scenario, while higher than the baseline, are really not sufficient to maintain a balanced budget through the forecast period. I'll note that a $2.5 million deficit appears in FY31, and it grows to $6 million towards the end of the forecast period in 44-45. So I think it solves a near-term problem, but over the long term, that still doesn't quite cut it. Next slide, please. So under this scenario, the general, as I kind of suggested before, the general fund would barely maintain a positive fund balance through 31-32, after which time, as you can see, it turns into an increasingly negative fund balance through the end of the forecast period. So that is not a sustainable option either. Next slide, please. So let's look at scenario 3, which we'll call the strong operating expenditure reduction strategies. Again, here the focus is more on the expenditure side, not on the revenue. And these strategies include increasing the employee pension contributions, again, shifting the medical contribution cost to employees, reducing or eliminating the medical benefit for new hires, same as the last ones. But here we are implementing general fund expenditure reductions as necessary to balance the budget. So you're giving, under this scenario, the city manager and your finance director license to say, hey, no matter what, we're going to cut this expenditure budget down to align it with the revenues that we're projecting for each successive year of the forecast period, no matter what. So now you see we're getting more closer to that, okay, is it going to be an unplanned kind of free-for-all, just kind of X% haircut across the board? Hopefully not. That's what we want to avoid. And I'm going to talk later about strategies on how to get there to the extent that you need to introduce some expenditure reductions. But that's what this models. It's the strong sort of expenditure strategies. Next slide, please. I'll note that, assuming that the city relies solely on expenditure strategies, the expenditure reductions needed to balance the budget range between $1 million and $7.6 million through the forecast period. So as Andy stated earlier, it starts gently. The deficits aren't that bad. But as time progresses, it's going to take more and more to balance the budget. And these reductions, so it's a balanced budget. This is a good graph, actually. It's not quite good what it took to get there, but at least this is the first graph that shows kind of a balanced budget in the forecast period, because all the lines kind of come together. They're kind of on top of each other, which shows revenues are aligned with expenditures. So I'll note that the reductions average approximately 12% of your annual budget. And that's a lot. That's a lot. I mean, you can just add like 3 departments to come up to that amount. But for purposes of our analysis, and on average, this 12% reduction would have to be sustained, and departments would need to obviously identify reductions in personnel, services, and supplies. And you might even have to look at your ongoing capital needs, maybe reduce capital as well, to the extent that the general fund supports capital in any way. But by far, the most impactful strategy out of the 4, there's 4 that I listed, is the giving your city manager and your finance director to give the city the haircut, just balancing the budget. It's that on average 12% budget reduction. That's kind of what it took to balance the budget. The other strategies really don't make a dent. It's really just kind of a drop in the bucket, not a whole lot with those other strategies. Next slide, please. So, of course, since the budget was largely balanced by forcing expenditure reductions just enough to align with revenue, fund balance remains pretty much positive through the forecast period. And again, you see that southward leaning line comparing it to baseline. Next slide, please. So here's where I'll start talking about expenditure reductions. In our mind, in our experience in working with cities, sometimes it takes a while for the city to figure out from a policy perspective and direction what they're going to do to right the ship, right? But you can start immediately, maybe for your budget coming for your next budget, you might consider short-term expenditure reductions and a tiered approach. And this is an example that I actually used in the city that I used to work for. Immediately after COVID, the city was heavily dependent on transient occupancy tax and sales tax, which, as we know, is the most volatile revenue sources that a city can have. It's highly dependent on people coming to your city and spending money, right? So we could consider this a short-term or medium-term bridge solution that relies on a combination of targeted reductions in operating accounts with, for example, underutilization trends. Find the fat in the budget. And I know your city typically ends with a year-end surplus, meaning revenues are typically higher. Nobody really spends every last dime of their budget that they're allocated in the year. And I know that finance directors typically are conservative with the way they budget their revenues. So year-end, there's typically a year-end surplus. So this would require you to kind of go in there and find the fat, account for it, and cut where necessary. You could defer capital spending, you could reduce transfers to other funds. So again, this would allow the city to balance budgets as it considers or awaits full implementation of either robust revenue measures or more significant and more thought out expenditure reductions. I don't know if you can see the numbers, but in this case, moving from left to right, low-hanging, if that tier 1 is not enough, then we move to tier 2. And in this case, we were looking at hiring freezes to the tune of 75,000. And if that's not enough, then we go to deferred capital funding. In the city that I work for, the general fund was a major contributor. That may not be the case for your city, but the general fund was a major contributor to capital funding, or It could be other funds, right? You would look at reducing those transfers out. We stopped at tier 3. We did not have to go further. Tier 4 was, we had an internal service fund that impacted, general fund operations, tapping into the contingency reserve, that's tier 5. And then finally, tier 6, which is the least desirable, was service level cuts. If all those aren't enough, then you start looking at service level cuts. And that's how we kind of approached and tied the funding gap for that particular year. So that's just an example of a short-term expenditure reduction strategy. Next slide, please. Let's go over scenario 4, and then I'll talk about how you would approach a more longer-term solution on the expenditure side. So this one is quite simple. We're just looking at an enhanced sales tax, local transaction and use tax enhancement, and an expenditure reduction strategy, again, similar as the previous one. It's just implementing general fund expenditure reductions as necessary to balance the budget. Next slide, please. So in this scenario, baseline expenditures, which is the red line, and forecast expenditures, which is the broken red line, are identical through 2930, and they're represented by the solid red line. But beginning in FY31, expenditure reductions are introduced. That's when those heavy reductions are kicked in to balance the budget, and they continue through the end of the forecast period to balance the budget. Forecast revenues, which are the black intermittent line, and forecast expenditures, red intermittent line, are identical and are represented by the intermittent red line. Again, that's because, the finance director was forced to sort of balance the budget that way. So in this case, the expenditure reductions needed to balance the budget range between 3.1 million and 7.4 million throughout the forecast period. It gets worse as time moves on. And in this case, the reductions average approximately 10% of the annual budget. And so for purposes of this analysis, we assume that on average, 10% of the annual general fund expenditure reduction target would be sustained. So this would have to be like a permanent haircut. You just really, have to align the budget that way. So again, that is also a very difficult scenario to pursue, which kind of leads to, and then with the balanced budget, you're just marginally maintaining positive fund balance because you're just trying to keep fund balance. You're doing whatever it takes. In other words, you're not going to have those big surpluses or any surpluses. Any surplus is going to be used to maintain your policy mandated fund balance, right? Which is sort of the bare minimum. Next slide, please. So that kind of brings us to long-term expenditure strategies that will need to be implemented as necessary. So as I said before, the lowest risk near-term treatments shown on that colorful slide, these are the proverbial low-hanging fruit that cities often seek to close budget gaps over the short run, right? There's like a blip in the economic cycle. You could tie yourself over for a year or two, that's fine. But the reality is that cities like yours that have a built-in structural deficit have to go beyond these short-term techniques to address these fiscal challenges. When you look at when you have a drop in revenues, expenditures are increasing, and especially given the fact that you'll be exhausting your retirement trust funds in, I believe, fiscal year 2930. That is a very impactful thing. That's why in a lot of these slides, you see that big drop-off beginning in that year, and then you really have to work hard to figure out how to balance the budget after that year. But you'll also have, as time passes, spikes in demands for services, and you'll just have a loss of capacity, and you'll be unlikely to overcome those problems by just doing the basics, right? So you're going to be forced to look at some riskier techniques, risky only because they're just very difficult, and you have to be careful. So in one category, there's controlling personnel costs. You'll have to consider things like wage freezes, hiring freezes, increasing part-time labor, reducing hours of pay, and things of that sort. You'll have to reduce capital spending or transfers out of the general fund to other funds. There could be deferment of equipment replacement costs and annual debt costs. You might have to use short-term debt to pay for vehicles, as an example. There could be organizational strategies through like maybe reorganization. You could try to implement a shared service model with neighboring cities for select programs that might make sense to do that. And then, of course, there's sourcing strategies. You can outsource certain programs, perhaps insource, or simply divest, eliminate programs altogether. So this gives you an example of things that I think City Council and staff will have to very strategically step through to kind of right the ship going forward. Certainly, I know you're interested in pursuing a revenue measure in the next election, and that's a good first step. Andy and I agree, but there's other things that I think the city needs to focus on, especially on the expenditure side as well. I think it has to be sort of a balance of both to hopefully over time get closer to balanced budgets. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we're a bit behind unless there's some lag in mine. We should be on the one labeled, the next one after that, scenario packages, closing thoughts. Okay, so closing thoughts. As I suggested before, the City Council will probably need to pick, given all the strategies we've laid out, kind of consider them all in finding a plan that is right for Pinole. I think a revenue measure is probably a given, and maybe another one could be considered in the near term as well, maybe the following year. There should be some consideration of service level expansions. You should be very careful with expanding FTE, especially in your MOU negotiations. I think you got to be very careful because that does add, that's a sort of permanent increase in expenditures. Whenever you do those MOU negotiations, you got to be very careful with those and adding bodies as well. And again, work on reducing your expenditures when vacancies occur, maybe consideration given to not refilling those positions until your fiscal recovery is well underway. So with that, I'll turn it back to Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. One thing, maybe just to clarify, when Steve was talking about those expenditure reductions of 10 to 12% in scenarios 3 and 4, remember that we're measuring from the baseline expenditure projections when we talk about those expenditure reductions.
Right.
If you look at the actual expenditures, even in those scenarios, you're still seeing actual nominal expenditure increases, but they're very small. So you're not seeing actual expenditure reductions in real terms. They're still going up a little bit year by year, but they're going down 10 to 12% from our baseline projections, or relative to what the status quo has been over the last several years. That's just an important clarification. I just wanted to make sure everybody understood. So other recommendations, this will be pretty quick, and this doesn't concern the budget or the structural deficit per se, but might have some ramifications towards how we solve it. Next slide, please. These are some things we noticed in working with Pinole that probably need to be considered. They are sort of policy recommendations that we offer up for your consideration. And they include the following items, and I'll go through them one by one. Next slide, please. So OPEB, that stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. And one that there's retiree medical benefits in Pinole and some other ones, but there should be a funding policy adopted, and we should try to fund those OPEB benefits. You'll see OPEB as a discussion item in your annual audit, and the annual audit tells you what the liability is for these OPEB benefits that have been promised. And it does go up every year. And the idea would be to fund as much of these OPEB liabilities as possible and to adopt a policy towards that end. And we would recommend that for your consideration. That would actually help buttress the city's fiscal position, because OPEB is one of those things that it doesn't really come out in the budget, but it's a significant liability that you find inside the audit papers of your city's assets and liabilities. Next slide, please. And then kind of related to that is a surplus utilization policy. Specify what you're going to use any budget surplus for. And one of the things to use the budget surplus for would be to pay down long-term obligations as a first choice, such as unfunded pensions or OPEB liabilities or indebtedness or lease obligations or infrastructure improvements or anything like that, as opposed to new program enhancements. Use the money to pay down liabilities that you already have and set this out as a policy so that if you get a surplus, you've already sort of decided, well, we're going to use this surplus for these already existing liabilities so that it's not so tempting to use it for new programs, because we all know how tempting it is to use some found money for new programs that everybody wants. But if you have a policy like this in place, it makes it incumbent to use it for existing liabilities. Next slide, please. Another thing, and this might seem counterintuitive, but it's really not, would be right now there's a general fund reserve balance of 50%, which is in excess of what is recommended. And we would recommend you go down from 50% to 25%, because that's really where the cities of about the same size tend to be. The GFOA, the Government Financial Officers Association, they actually recommend 16%. But the reality is, for smaller cities, they tend to want to carry a little bit higher reserves, and I think for good reason. Is because they can be buffeted a little more by things like disasters or recessions, and so they tend to want to carry a little bit more. But we would recommend reducing this from 50% to 25% and using some of those dollars to pay down those liabilities that are currently embedded within your balance sheet. Next slide, please. And one of the liabilities that's also in your balance sheet is the need to establish some internal service funds, which are a pretty common tool that cities use to fund recurring needs that they have for things like equipment replacement and other things, technology that they need to constantly replenish. And these are, we give you some typical examples of internal service funds or ISFs. And it would be good for Pinole to promulgate some ISFs and begin to fund them, so you don't have so many spikes when it comes to having to pay off for new equipment and things like that. And this will basically reduce shock to the budget when you have to pay for something that comes along, like a new piece of equipment that can cost $500,000 or something like that. or a new piece of technology that can easily cost that much too. Next slide. Let me wrap up by going over some of the next steps that we see here. And as I think Steve and I have both covered, that the next step is really look at those first three tools: expenditure control and cost shifts, service delivery alternatives, and revenue enhancements, to see how we can close the structural deficit while maintaining service levels. And we've given you two dozen or more examples that have been implemented in many cities to explore. And that should be done ahead of having to do service level reductions, because that's not as good of an option. Next slide. And in terms of the revenue measure, that needs to get going right now. And we know that you already are looking at some polling, which is smart, to see what's the best revenue measure to put on the ballot. That will need to happen in June. You probably want to make a decision in June, because you have to actually notify the county of what you're going to put on the ballot, probably in August, late July or August, so that it can be on the ballot in November of 2024. But based on our analysis, you need to consider a revenue measure, and the revenue measure would probably take effect the first of the year of 2025. Next slide. And then in terms of overall fiscal sustainability, there's a lot of other things to look at. This is kind of a flow chart of how that would go, in sort of in conjunction with budget process and after the budget process. But we would think and suggest that you look at the budget, look at the strategies we've suggested and see which ones are the best fits, and take them to the next step, and develop an implementation action plan, and then begin implementing that work. Because again, I'll close with what I started with. You have time. Your budget deficit is not disastrous, but it's significant, and time's not your friend. And don't waste it. And so I'll close there, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you for that report. I'll go to my right, Vice Mayor Sasai. Do you have any questions?
Thanks, Mayor Toms, and thanks, Andy and Steve, for the presentation. Lots of important decisions to be made and to be made soon. So I want to start off actually by going back to the statewide ballot measure you had mentioned, and I want to see if we can summarize that for those in the chambers about what that entails. What are the exact restrictions to be placed on localities in terms of raising taxes at the local level, but also revisions to Prop 13?
Andy, did you want to take that one?
Sure. The biggest requirement is that new revenues of any significance need to be approved by the voters, and that's the biggest hurdle that you face. And so, really, in California, that's just what we live with. The voters are going to have to approve any significant general fund revenues, and in fact, if it's a revenue that's going to be used for a special purpose, a designated special purpose, you would need a 2/3 vote. But what we've recommended are general purpose revenue measures.
Thank you. And has there been polling on that statewide ballot measure so far, and what has that shown in terms of what the voters have favored at this point?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know about you, Andy.
I think the city is beginning to do some polling now, but I will say, and there's something that anybody can look at called the California Financial Almanac that's online, and you can take a look at election results going back over 20 years, And you will see that most local ballot measures for new revenues in municipalities do pass. It's something like 7 out of 10 or 6 out of 10. It's not all, but most do pass. And they're benefited when a unanimous city council can get behind a revenue measure. Local measures are more supported than other types of measures. And if I would encourage you all to take a look at that site, which has got a wealth of information on local revenue measures, and you'll see which measures pass in every local election going back several decades.
Gotcha. And so past data from the California Financial Almanac can sort
Yep,
of
California
guide
Financial
what would
Almanac.
might happen this November.
Yep.
Gotcha.
I'll also add that the governor himself and the California Special District Association filed an emergency petition to the California Supreme Court for a pre-election challenge to the initiative. I don't think it was successful, but there are efforts underway by such organizations to challenge the measure. So I think from that perspective, there's a lot of interest groups that are, that represent cities that are not for that, and that they'll be challenging that initiative. Whether they'll be successful is another thing, but there is a movement afoot to challenge it.
Thank you for the info. So I'm just going to move along to just my questions in order of the staff report. So the criteria used in evaluating budget strategies, one of the factors is potential for community support. And how is that measured? How is that calculated by you all? Is that just generally how these sort of strategies have panned out in other jurisdictions, or specifically in Pinole? How's that been calculated?
Yes, that's more general. Based on our experience, we know, for example, that a UUT that kind of more directly impacts your citizens' pocketbook than, say, a transient occupancy tax. Let's use those two as an example. For visitors that come from outside of the city that stay in your hotels, your citizens will feel less impacted than, say, the passage of a utility user tax or a franchise fee, because those are directly passed on by either the utilities or the franchise companies in your city to the pocket. And the citizens know that. So that's why we're saying that some, I think, are more easier to pass than others in terms of community impact. So that example, I think that's a good example.
Thank you. One of the strategies mentioned in budget scenario 1 is the business license tax. And can you summarize the flat fixed fee amounts and the business types that Pinole has in place right now?
I can respond to
Me
that.
too.
So
Okay, go ahead.
the business license structure that we use now is based on the number of employees for the most part, and then it increases incrementally after a certain amount of employees. Now, there are other business licenses such as for rental properties and things of that, but there's a flat fee right now. That fee is $160, and then it goes up incrementally based on employees.
Gotcha. And what are the levels of employees?
Excuse me.
What are levels of employees per category?
So it's one employee is the flat rate, and then I believe the next tier
I think you said 15,
is-
or was it above that?
it's actually below that once it get to 4 employees or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but
Gotcha. And so the restructuring of the business license tax or an increase in the fees, is that required going to the voters for approval?
yes, for gross receipts.
Even a restructuring of the tax, but not an increase in the fees.
That's correct. So not an increase in the fees. We increase the fees annually through a separate review process at the end of the calendar year, and that's based on the municipal code. But for a change to that, such as the gross receipts business license, it will require voter approval.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. The visuals in Figure 3, 5, and 7 for each budget scenario, so it shows the revenue strategy forecast compared with the baseline budget. Do those all assume that the revenue strategies for each of the scenarios are implemented in the first fiscal year, so this fiscal year 24-25?
Yes, I believe it does.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. The reason why I'm sort of looking at that is because a lot of the strategies, say in Tier 1, specifically for sort of revenue enhancement, a lot of that will take multiple election cycles to implement, right? So that might mean 24 to 26 to 28, or it can mean special elections, so on and so forth. And so one question I had in mind for a long time was how many tax measures can you place on a ballot before voters start to not even favor any selection?
If I may just preface that, I don't know exactly how many. I think as many as you're willing to have fail at once. Because, I don't think, as I said before, it isn't realistic that you would introduce, even though I modeled it that way, you would never do that. And really the point of modeling it that way is just to show sort of the dramatic revenue impacts that you would need to see to realize something closer to fiscal sustainability. That was really the point of it. I recognize that realistically, that would not be feasible. Do you agree, Andy? I don't think there's a limit per se to the number of ballot measures, but from a practicality standpoint, you'd never do more than 2, and even
No,
2
there's not a limit,
Yeah.
legally, but there's a limit practically.
Yeah.
And I think that the city should work with its polling experts to decide about which tax measures are best, and then think about, as you said, think about phasing this over the next 4 to 6 years, because you've got several valid, solid revenue enhancement options, and you may want to look at it over multiple years.
Gotcha. Thank you. And I just throw it out there because I think these visuals are great. Looks pretty, but I think it's virtually impossible to pass all those tax measures in one given year. And the last question I had was on budget scenario 2 and 3. So there's mention to implementing general fund expenditure reductions. In scenario 2, you put out there $500,000 in reductions. So how was that number calculated? Where did that come from?
I believe that really wasn't designated towards any program or department, and I'll just turn it over to Markeisha, how she incorporated in the model. I think it was just sort of a haircut type of way of making the cuts, but it wasn't, because of course that requires a lot of deliberation, right? That requires a lot of discussion with your department heads and maybe even members of the community to do something like that. I don't think we went to that level of determination. That's more of a council thing. But I think she was just very simply just kind of gave it a haircut. Markeisha, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yes, that's correct. And we were looking at the fiscal year 24, 25, for example, that shows $1 million deficit. So if we said, okay, well, what is half of that? Let's look at $500,000 reduction in addition to some other options. And then and I believe in scenario 3, we did or increased that to a $1 million reduction.
Gotcha. So just based off of the 24-25 budget.
Yes, looking at the starting point, yes.
Thank you. Those are my questions. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. To our city treasurer.
I've been here before. And we made the necessary cuts that we needed to cut, but we had to cut a lot faster. I believe most of the scenarios based on fixed revenues rather than variable revenues. And to throw into that mix, if there was a recession or something like that, it would enhance the process quite a bit faster, would it not, in the making the cuts? And right now, the economy is fairly steady and probably as good as it's going to get. But what I see is reduction of income, especially from sales tax, as more and more people buy online. The people that would come here from other communities and pay for their goods are buying it online. Therefore, we get no tax revenue out of that. So we're pretty well fixed on sales tax now, and probably going to get a slight reduction in that, so I see that happening. There's a lot of things I could comment on. I don't have a lot of questions on the report. I think the report was very good. Thank you very much for covering it well. You identified definitely all of the potential income sources that the city could look at. This is going to be a project not just for this finance subcommittee, and we appreciate it, but the entire city council is going to have to weigh in on this, and they're going to have to spend a great amount of time going through it and defining how they're going to be able to fix this in the next 10 years. They do have a situation where they could fix this year's deficit, and that's identified here also. I think that probably the quickest way to, it's just my opinion, but the quickest way to, I marked it down someplace. I just got to remember where it is. I think I can remember it. On the reduction of the general fund reserve may be the one thing that the council want to take a look at. I don't like to do that because that's how we got into this situation originally when we had to make all the cuts, was we had used up our general fund reserve. But it seems like an immediate solution for temporarily would be to cut that that reserve, at least for the next year, maybe 2 years, and then reconsider it. And that would get us through the toughest part of this, of balancing the budget right now, and then the rest of your scenario, or the rest of your program about the utility taxes and the other taxes, I think that's more long-term that the city could take a look at, and the council would have more time to establish a program, be it utility tax, be it parcel tax, be it whatever, that they would be able to deal with on that basis. And I agree with you. I don't think this is an emergency situation right now, but it will become one if we don't do anything, and you're absolutely correct. Those are basically comments. I don't have any questions because, like I say, I've been here before. And so you do what you have to do, and I think the entire council needs to weigh in on that rather than just the finance subcommittee. Thank you.
Thank you. Couple of questions that I have, and like Vice Mayor Sasai, I jotted down the election years, and I'm thinking, if we did a utility tax measure this year, then in 2026 we do, sales tax measure, and every year do something to increase the chances that we can get a successful outcome of the election. We have to be really cautious that we don't waste, an election cycle on something that's not going to be supported, because then that'll just push back the deficit. I think we have had people comment that, if we're going to ask for revenue, we have to be prepared to do some cuts. And I recall in 2008, 2009, being a resident who was pretty involved. Things, they looked almost micromanaged. The water deliveries, how much we were paying for, various services, and were there those necessary? And I would think that this upcoming fiscal year is the year that we need to look at those things. The programs that can be easily cut or trimmed, because we do need to show the public that we are seriously looking at our expenses, especially when we're going to be asking for additional revenue. My question the question that I have is, if we were to reduce the reserve, and say we reduce it by 50% in the next fiscal year instead of incrementally, we're looking at about $17 million. And I'm wondering, do we just drop that into the trust account to then buy us some more time with the OPED funds, or do we pay that down to get the baseline OPED amount reduced. I'm just curious on, what would be the best investment we could make on that?
I think our conclusion was anything that would spare the general fund ongoing expenditures. And there's a number of things you could choose from.
Okay, thank you. And then I think I had a couple of more. I think that's all I have for now. Those are all the notes that I have. And I do understand we have a member of the public who wants to speak, so we'll call on him.
Thank you. Rafael Menes.
Greetings, Finance Subcommittee, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Treasurer, staff, members of the public. My name is Rafael Menes. I'm a resident of Pinole. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I have a few comments I want to make. First, in the consultant presentation, it sounded like you were saying basically that scenario 3 was the only one that ultimately resulted in balanced budgets. But it seemed as though scenario 1, whether feasible or not, also resulted in balanced budgets because there was simply that much more revenue. Secondly, with regards to basically the impact of fiscal cuts, what would a 12% cut across the board look like? Let's say, just for example, the police department, a 12% cut there. Does that mean firing 2 officers, 3, 5 for COD fire? Well, we can't do a 12% cut there because we have it by contract, so we would need to do higher cuts elsewhere. Thirdly, if we're talking about expenditure reductions like cutting out outflows from the general fund to other funds, it's going to have a big impact on recreation because as a matter of equity, the city routinely charges less than full cost recovery for its recreation programs because people simply can't afford to pay at the full cost recovery rate. And so there's no utilization of the programs. We saw that even before COVID and certainly during it. So I guess ultimately the question that the council and the community as a whole needs to ask itself is, do we want to keep on being a full service city? Because if we need to make drastic cuts, if we need to say, no, we're not willing to raise any revenue measures, we're not willing to increase sales tax, we're not willing to increase users utility tax, we're not willing to pass a real property transfer tax, we just want to continue on as things are, well, scenario 4 is already accounted for that. We can't. Things will fail catastrophically starting in 2030 if we do that. So if we don't want to pay for the obligations we've already incurred, and this is not hiring a new economic development director, this is not repaving the city's roads, this is just obligations. I'll remind everyone again, the city has already taken on. Then what are you willing to cut and how much? If across the board cuts aren't feasible, what departments are you willing to eliminate in order to have the city continue to exist? Because strategically speaking, the city's core priority is its continued existence. You could say, oh, we'd like to have police or fire or roads, but as an entity, the main thing the city has to do is not go bankrupt. And if that means, as Treasurer Swearinger noted, shutting down facilities, furloughing staff, cutting back on staff, that leads to issues. And finally, I note that long-term capital deferments have already been done over the past several decades, and therefore there may not be much fat to cut in that category. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. Let me just look again over. No other hands raised. So we'll bring it back. There's no action on this. My only other comment would be timing. I think it's useful, it would be useful to know, for instance, we have MOUs with all of our employee groups.
Yes.
So what would it take? Would we have to wait until those MOUs expire? I don't think we're in an emergency situation like they were back in 2008, 2009, but it would be good to demonstrate, to identify what's the timing. We have MOUs that go for, I think we're starting year 2 on a
Yes.
3-year program. And then the franchise fees. We've been discussing the solid waste franchise fees, which could take effect as early as July of 2025. But I'm not sure what the other franchise fees involve, like cable TV and some of the other ones that were identified. So that might be, it might be good to note that for when this comes to the council. So with that, are there any other further comments? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. No, I definitely agree with Mayor Toms. I believe that this is the year that we closely scrutinize the budget and show taxpayers that we're fostering their money as best as we can. Last question I have is, when is the last time that Pinole has utilized this, not a special election, primary election for a ballot measure? How often does that usually happen in Pinole?
The last time that I recall it was 2009 and 10. We did both the sales tax, 1 point for 1/4 cent, and we did the utility tax. And we were fortunate then, we had a great group of volunteer people who went out and walked the streets and did everything else. I mean, it wasn't just the city council saying, here's your tax measure. We had people go out and physically go door to door and make that happen. And that took a lot of community togetherness to make that work, but we made it work, and we made a utility tax come to life because we needed it very badly, and we made them understand that. But you almost had to do it one-on-one.
City Treasurer, that was primary election of 2000, you said 9 or 2008?
I can't remember the exact year. It was 2009, 10, right in there. 11, when we lost redevelopment, that's when it really got critical.
Gotcha. So I think we should take a look at utilizing primary elections in the 26 and 28 election cycles to see what we can do there. Just want to bring it up.
Yeah, that's.
I think the polling is really important, and I think the council should look at that. And I would recommend to the council that they start setting up a polling for the various opportunities that have been noted to us here today, and that the same presentation should come to the city council. The sooner the better. I would put it on the next agenda if you have an opportunity. I'd put some other things aside maybe because it's not critical, but it's definitely a tough situation. Oh, one more question. Are there a lot of other cities in the same situation that we're in, to the consultants?
Yeah, there are a lot of cities in the same situation. The Great Recession was wrenching for, I think, almost every municipality, and there's been a great desire to catch up for all the spending was choked off for probably a half dozen years after that recession. And there's been a great desire to catch up. And many cities have tried to catch up with staffing, with cost of living raises, and things like that. And many of them, after having caught up, have found themselves to be in a little bit more precarious condition as they project out the next 20 years because the staffing increases are quite expensive. But they lost so much staffing to the Great Recession that in many cases they didn't have much choice but to try to rebuild their staffing. But the personnel costs have grown quite a bit, and you all know how expensive the pensions are, and that hasn't really been completely reformed. Even though the state made efforts to do that, they're still quite expensive.
Okay, thank you.
So I would say this is not an uncommon situation at all. Many cities are struggling with this, and I think a lot of cities are very worried about the next recession.
Yes, we definitely are. We want to avoid the drastic cuts that had to be done back in.
Right, and a lot of
previous
cities
years.
are still very, many of us went through those drastic cuts that had to be made in the Great Recession, and we know that is not the way to do things.
Right, well, it is a benefit that we are on the early part of this issue, and I do like the idea of using for 2026 and 2028 the primary elections, because that can help inform the budget that we're going to be doing just, a few months later.
And Pinole is definitely ahead of the curve. We've seen a lot more cities reaching out. Pinole reached out last year at this time. We're seeing a lot more cities reaching out today than were reaching out last year. So Pinole is definitely ahead of the curve.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for that report and recognize our staff for bringing this to us early on. And then we'll move on to, we're going to take things out of order. We're going to need to hear about the capital improvement plan baseline budget. That's item 4C.
Okay,
next.
thank you.
All right, thank you.
Before that starts, I'm going to have to leave, unfortunately. I have another commitment, but thank you. And
Part of it, or are you going to take off now?
I think I'm going to have to, what time we got? You know what, I'll make an appointment with him tomorrow and I'll have him do it for me individually. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, sure.
Mayor, excuse me, if I can make one point just on the last item, I just wanted to mention that we are bringing this information back to the full city council on April 30th at the budget workshop. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Dave, can you please pull up the presentation for the CIP? Thank you. It's a pretty short presentation. The detailed project reports are attached. The draft reports are attached to the staff report and to the agenda. Next slide, please. So the draft CIP plan for 2024 and until 2028-29. The CIP is a 5-year plan used to identify and implement cities' capital needs. The draft 5-year CIP contains 31 capital projects and 5 infrastructure assessments. And for fiscal year 24-25, there are 29 capital projects slated for work and about 5 infrastructure assessments. The project categories are facilities, parks, sewer, stormwater, streets and roads, and infrastructure assessments. Next slide, please. Summary of projects in the draft CIP. There are a few of the projects that is expected to be completed by June 30, 2024, and those are listed here. Those are some of the infrastructure assessment that we expect to complete. Some of them are already been done, maybe reporting on final report. We completed one of the stormwater project. We added some new projects for the fiscal year 24-25 in the draft plan, and which can be discussed further in our workshop with the council. The projects outlined here is one of the wastewater treatment plant's boiler replacement. We will discuss about this particular item maybe a little more during our workshop. That may move to a future year. When I was preparing this, we had it for 24-25, but that may move to a future year. We have added a storm drain creek discharge improvement, which is an emergency work that we need to do. Some of our recent inspections showed that some of those drains are failing. We also are proposing to add a sidewalk rehab program and also a road maintenance repair program for the next this fiscal year and continuing to the future years. There are some of the projects I have recommended maybe removed from the CIP as other projects would actually be taking some of those scope of those are here, like energy upgrades, tree mitigation, and installation of the high-capacity trash bins. Next slide, please. A tentative schedule as proposed is here. If there are any recommendations from the Finance Subcommittee, we will include that in the CIP draft and we'll bring it to the workshop with the City Council on April 30th. And the Planning Commission will have ability to review this during May. And we'll also be bringing it to the preliminary proposed CIP to City Council in May, and the revised proposed to City Council in June, and the final proposed City Council will be on the June 18th. So this is the budget summary set for the 24-25 fiscal year, and just to give you an idea of various dollar amounts for the different funds, and the total funds are budget for the capital is about $12.8 million. I'm happy to answer any questions from the Finance Subcommittee.
Vice Mayor?
Thanks for the presentation. Very straightforward. Appreciate it. One of the questions I have here is some of the projects in the CIP do not have priority scores. Does staff just need more time to calculate that?
Yes, we're still actually working on it, and during the workshop I will have better details for those.
Gotcha. So it may come back to council with the priority score.
Yes.
Thank you. I want to ask about the status of the Appian Way Complete Streets project, and have we collected SIM fees, or we've received the collected SIM fees from the county?
That for the Appian Way Complete Streets project?
Because it lists the STEM fees as one of the grants that we got awarded, or we would want to be awarded.
Yes, I believe we got about $100,000 for that, but the total project now which would come out of that is more than what we have in our budget. But to complete the design part of it, evaluation of the complete streets, we have already the $100,000 that has been awarded to us. We do have.
So the STEM fees have been awarded to us.
Yes.
$100,000, and that's to go to preliminary design.
Yes, correct.
We don't have any sort of approximation of what this would cost after the preliminary design.
I believe it is in the range of $3 million.
Thanks. I know the council had placed the San Pablo Avenue Complete Streets project in the CIP last cycle. I also noticed there's no unfunded section of the CIP. Will that be also available when it comes back to council?
Yes, there is no unfunded amount because for this fiscal year 24-25, we may have the full funding, but it will for the next one for 25-26, because San Pablo Avenue Bridge project itself is a huge unfunded dollar amount that will show up in the next fiscal year.
Okay. Thank you. And do we plan on applying for those STEM fees in not this fiscal year?
No, for San Pablo Avenue Bridge, it is mostly will be the highway bridge program funding. So
not the bridge, but the Complete Streets project is what I was referring to.
I see. Yes, once the preliminary design actually completes and we have some project in, then we will be eligible to apply for the.
So probably fiscal year 25.
Yeah, next fiscal year.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so if we see any of these projects and the source includes a grant, that means that the grant has been received.
Yes,
awarded.
yes. We have already the money. If we have a dollar amount, that means that money has been already awarded to us.
Is there any way to show what grants staff anticipates on applying for in each of the different projects? Because if not, it just shows it comes out of general fund or a different source.
Okay.
Right. So if it's a traffic safety improvement then you could say, oh, staff is thinking about applying for XYZ grant at this point in time, and it could be we could be awarded X number of dollars.
I see. So, I mean, here what I can say is that some of the grants, whatever the funds we have here, those we have already been awarded. That's why you see the here.
Gotcha.
Yes.
So I'm asking if it's possible for staff to just list the different grants that we anticipate on applying for. Is
Okay.
it possible?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Gotcha. That's all the questions I have right now, I believe.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just in response to the last question, perhaps Townsend and Associates can help match the projects with the grant opportunities, because some of them have, some of the projects are really attractive for certain funding sources, and it would be a good opportunity to, demonstrate where those fit together.
Yeah.
On the removed projects, energy upgrades, is that for capital buildings?
Yes, those are for our facilities. So that I removed just because we are just completing the energy assessment, the energy conservation, generation and storage assessment, and that has recommendations. So whatever recommendations they have for each of those facilities, I would put projects referring to those facilities rather than a energy upgrade as a whole. That's why I wanted to just take that out, but add projects per the recommendation from.
Okay, I just want to make sure that those would still be eligible for grant funding, even if they're not on the CIP, but because they're on an assessment that you've
Yeah.
prepared.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The tree mitigation, is that to mitigate for the eucalyptus trees on
yes.
Pinole or by the senior housing?
By the senior housing. And I believe we had previously had about $150,000, $75,000 for 2 years. And because of the last winter when we actually removed a lot of trees there, we spent most of that there. But there is no discussion, or there was no direction whether we want to remove further eucalyptus tree from there or not.
Okay.
If there is interest from the council, we can always add that.
And I'll just make a side note that the County Office of Emergency Services is doing the local hazard mitigation plan, which goes out for public review on Monday. And there was an effort to add some language about the eucalyptus trees being a risk. So those might become eligible for FEMA grants, when that plan gets approved.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And then the installation of the high-capacity trash bins, I understand that, it's really almost impossible for us to empty those because it would take some new machinery, so I'm fine with that coming off.
Yeah, and the status of that, we installed 2 actually in our downtown area. Apparently they don't get filled because people are not using that as often. And a good thing that we did a pilot to understand how it can be used. Otherwise, it would have been a waste of huge amount of our resources.
Yeah, good, thank you. Okay, I'll see if there's any members of the public that have questions, and I don't see any raised hands and no members of the public here. So any closing remarks or questions?
Closing question. So for projects in the past, has staff ever reached out to Gary Mendy's office for a letter of support when you apply for those grants?
We have actually, for the letter of support, no, I haven't. Except for San Pablo Avenue Bridge. That's when we actually asked for the letter of support. But we have reached out for other the earmarks for various projects for the last 2 years, and nothing has been fruitful yet.
The grant for the BNSF Railroad Bridge, was that the BIO funds?
Oh, come again?
The bipartisan infrastructure law.
Yes, yes.
funds.
There are some earmarked funds for, I believe, for each assembly member or congress member. They have some, and we reached out to, I think, Assembly Member Buffy's and Giramendi's office for 3 different projects in the last 2 years.
Gotcha. Thank you. I had an opportunity to speak with Harpreet from Garamendi's office this past weekend, and he was saying it's like low-hanging fruit to just ask the member to provide a letter of support, and I think it goes a long way when folks consider what grants to award. So it might be an idea for some of the projects we have in the CIP here to reach out to
Okay.
our office.
Sure.
Okay, and then I had a follow-up. This isn't really related to the CIP, but I've had some questions lately on fixing our roads. And I wanted to just ask you, for the record, when do we get the list of overlay streets that you're going to be doing during the construction season?
So we have completed our PTAP report, which the consultants have completed. That will be coming to the council for adoption, and it has a list. In the last year, we have not done any slurry seal work just because we didn't have any funds to apply for. And we have currently a project that is on Pinole Valley, the arterial rehabilitation project, which is on our list right now. And we expect that project to be happening this coming fiscal year. But I have actually hold that project going forward. Design is complete, but I hold that project because of staffing constraints. And I had an opportunity to actually discuss this with the county, who is applying for a project for a grant under Safety for All. And they have said recently to us that they're going to include the Pinole Valley Road project to their application. So I'm holding off until I hear from them. And that project, we had to divide it in 2 phases, phase 1 and phase 2, so that actually whatever funds we have available, it will be spent there. That's why there was no slurry seal project, because their funds were not available. But for this coming fiscal year, what I have really asked, when I say that I have added one project, say road maintenance repairs. Really, my thought here is to have a contract which can actually address some of the major failures on the road. We don't have enough money to actually repave entire roads, but at least remove some of the major failure locations on the road, and in the next cycle we can see if we can slurry seal those roads, just to get by a few years until we have either a grant or a revenue. So the list will be published. We have it available. Once it is adopted, it will be publicly available for people to see. And if there are funds available to do slurry seal, we'll go ahead and put some of those projects in our CIP.
Okay, and then one more is that I get communication from a gentleman on Greenfield Circle.
Yes.
And just wondering where that road, the condition fits with the condition of all of the other needs that we have in the city. Is it close to the top priority or in the middle, or?
I would say somewhere in the middle. Greenfield Circle, I have seen that road, I have been there. So there are certain locations which are really bad. And I have our maintenance staff is going to repair a portion of it. And that's it's scheduled, but not the entire street. Okay. And my thought was to, I'm putting together a contract right now to repair some of the roads on some of the portion of APN Way, and I may do some of the Greenfield Circle where it is really bad, those patches. Okay. And then maybe next year do a slurry seal when it possible.
Can you either let me know or let Mr.
Safi, yep.
And then actually, one more. I noticed that Brant Court is on the CIP for future, and that's a cul-de-sac that doesn't really have, it's not a major travel throughway, and I'm wondering if we can somehow review whether or not that needs to remain on the CIP, you know, and kind of compare what the priorities are.
Yeah, I believe Brent code was added by council because
There was
it
a
was
House move.
yeah, that has not happened, and that's why we have been holding this project. But the house move application actually came through recently, and they're going to move the house
Oh, okay.
pretty soon. So we're holding that, and if they move the house, then we'll be completing that
Okay.
project.
Yeah, I wasn't sure the status of that. Okay.
Is Brand Court the cul-de-sac that's cut in a weird, sort of weird way?
Yeah,
Like the semicircle, right?
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, with that, we can move on to go back to item B. Thank you.
Thank you.
And item B is the fiscal year 24-25 general fund baseline budget.
Yes, thank you. So this item is for the Finance Subcommittee to receive a report on the fiscal year 2024-25 general fund baseline budget and provide any recommendations, if any. Basically, this is a draft of where we are, the fiscal year 2024-25 budget. So I'll go into some details about how we got there and next steps. Next slide, please. And next slide. So we'll discuss the budget development process and then look at some of the details from the general fund baseline budget and discuss next steps. Next slide. So this is an overview of the budget development process. It's basically the steps that we use to get to the first version of the budget, which is the preliminary proposed. So we start with the current year's budget, which in this case is fiscal year 2023-24. We also incorporate any mid-year changes outside of those that are one time, and we use that as a starting point to start to build the next year's budget. We create the fiscal year 2024-25 budget by taking the ongoing revenues and expenditures as reflected in the current year's budget and factoring in known or assumed changes. So we include any contract obligations such as through the those that are detailed in the labor agreements, any other professional services contracts. We look at inflationary factors and build that on top of the current year's budget to get the next year's baseline. We also have an internal process where the city manager, the finance department, and meets with each individual department to review their budgets in detail. And we also address any proposed special projects or any proposed changes to programs, so adding any special programs or increasing service levels. Those are discussed during those internal meetings. And then the finance department and the city manager works together to consider the department requests based on the budget situation, and we work to prepare the preliminary proposed budget for the city council's consideration. Next slide. So as we develop the budget, we do work within the framework of the city's structurally balanced budget policy. This policy applies to the general fund operating budgets, and it is to create a proposed general fund operating budget that is structurally balanced. And what that means is that ongoing operating expenditures are funded by ongoing operating revenues. The idea is to ensure the sustainability of service and expenditure levels by requiring that we adopt a balanced budget. Next slide. So looking at the components that makes up the baseline budget, it is made up of recurring or ongoing revenues, and those are revenues that the city can reasonably expect to continue to receive on an annual basis over the next 5 to 10 years. This is also based on our revenue policy of the city. That includes our ongoing tax revenues, fines and fees, interest income, licenses and permits, also charges for services for contracts that we have with other governmental agencies to provide services. It also includes the recurring expenditures, which are those ongoing costs that relates to ongoing city services and activities. That includes our salaries and benefits, our utilities, maintenance and supplies, and agreements that we have with other agencies. Next slide. So items that are not included in the baseline budget would include any non-recurring items or what we call one-time items. And examples of those would be one-time receipts, such as a one-time sale of property or grant awards. And the non-recurring expenditures are costs that are related to activities that are not ongoing as well. So we have a number of one-time initiatives that are included in the budget as directed by the City Council. We have several staff-recommended budget additions for special projects that may be one-time, and then capital projects, because they're not ongoing, they're considered one-time, although they may span several fiscal years from start to completion. Next slide. So some highlights from the general fund baseline budget that you have before you this afternoon is that it, at this point, is not balanced. Our ongoing expenditures exceed ongoing revenues. The baseline budget revenues and expenditures are consistent with the prior forecast, and what that means is this is a status quo budget in nature, in that the staffing and service levels remain the same. So there are no major changes included in this baseline. Also, our major revenues continue to be stable, but they are growing at a slower rate than our expenditures. And you saw some of that information in the presentation on the long-term financial planning. Next slide. So here's a summary of the baseline budget revenues. And if we compare the 2 years, fiscal year 2023-24, to the upcoming budget year, we are looking at an increase of approximately $1.8 million, or 7%. And I'll go into more detail on the various items that are included in this budget in the following slides. Next slide. So looking at the general fund baseline budget, these are the expenditures, and again, comparing the 2 years, we're looking at an increase of $2.5 million, which represents a 9% increase. And at this point, our expenditures exceed our revenues by $1.3 million. That also equates to 6% of the baseline budget. Next slide. So here's a depiction of where our general fund dollars come from. As I mentioned, most of our general fund dollars come from tax revenues, so they make up about 80% of the budget, with the top two being property tax and sales tax. And we have other smaller pots of funds that come from other areas. Other revenues, that's most of our fees, fines, fees, licenses, and permits. We also receive business license fees, and then our charges for services, that is basically our interagency agreement that we have with the cities of Hercules and San Pablo to provide dispatch services. The transfer in, which is a significant amount, also comes in from the pension trust. Next slide. So going into a little bit more detail on the various categories that make up our general fund revenues, starting with our property tax. This is a value-based tax imposed on real property and tangible personal property. It's set at a fixed statutory rate of 1%, and of that, the city of Pinole receives 19%. Our property tax revenue is made up of the basic 1% property tax, as well as the redevelopment property tax trust fund. And for 24-25 baseline budget, we're assuming a net increase of 9%. And that's mostly due to the increase in the residual RPTTF revenue resulting from the retirement of debt from the former redevelopment agency, as well as the dissolution of the successor agency, which is happening this year. Next slide. So our sales tax are imposed on purchases in Pinole, and it is 9.75%. The city receives the statewide standard, also known as the Bradley-Byrne sales tax of 1%. We also have two half-cent sales tax, Measure S 2006 and 2014. And for the fiscal year 2024-25, we're assuming a 3% increase, and this is based on the projections provided by our sales tax consultant, HDL. Next slide. We also have the utility users tax. This is an 8% tax levied on the consumption of telecommunications, gas, and electricity. We've experienced over the last 3 to 4 years higher growth rates in the gas and electricity segments in particular. We're seeing that the telecommunication segment is starting to level off a bit or even decrease, but that is more than made up for in the gas and electricity segments. We're assuming a 2% increase or growth rate for next fiscal year based on trends. Next slide. For the franchise tax, which is levied on public utilities and corporations that supply gas, electricity, cable, and refuse services, the fees are paid based on the franchise agreements that we have with the 4 agencies. We're assuming an 8% increase, and this is based on historical trends. We're also seeing significant growth, mostly in the gas and electricity segments. Next slide. So intergovernmental taxes come from the motor vehicle in lieu fee that is levied and collected by the state, and it's the tax on the ownership of registered motor vehicles within the state. And for the baseline budget, we're assuming a 4% increase. This is also consistent with projections provided by the property tax consultant because it is tied to that same source of revenue. Next slide. For the transient occupancy tax, which is levied on short-term lodging for 30 days or less, we're assuming a 2% increase, and that is based on historical trends and what we're seeing in the hotel industry. Next slide. The next is our business license tax. This is assessed on all businesses doing business within city limits, whether they are in or whether they're located within the city or located outside of the city but doing business with the city. We're all required to have a business license, and we are assuming a 2% increase based on historical trends. Next slide. The next is our charges for services. As I mentioned before, that category is primarily made up of the revenue that we receive from agencies where we have an interagency agreement to provide dispatch services to the city of Hercules and Sao Paulo. The baseline budget assumes a 5% increase, and this is based on the new 5-year agreement that went into effect on July 1st of last year. Next slide. And next we have our other revenue category. So this includes all other miscellaneous revenue sources, including fees, permits, interest, income, reimbursements, miscellaneous revenues that we may receive. We are assuming for this year a 34% increase, and this is more of a catch-up. The city did conduct a comprehensive user fee study back in 2022, and with that, we realized that there were some fees that we were undercharging for providing those services, and so we have caught up with those in the master fee schedule, and we've seen some significant increases in this year with that trend expected to continue to next year. So that's where you see the substantial increase of 34%. Next slide. And then lastly, we have our transfers in, and this is the transfer from the pension trust to offset the increase in pension costs in the general fund. So for this next segment, I'm going to go into the general fund expenditures that are included in the baseline budget. So here is an overview of where our general fund dollars go. The 3 major categories are salaries and wages and benefits, which make up about 59% of total costs. And then the third largest category is the professional services. Now, that number increased last year and this year, and that's just because the fire department transitioned from the city to the Contra Costa County Fire Protection District, and we have a service agreement with them, and so that is now reflected in professional services. So we've had those costs that have shifted away from personnel costs to professional services. And then we have other smaller categories that support operating activities in the various departments. We also have transfers out to 2 funds in the form of operating subsidies, as those funds are not able to recover 100% of the cost to provide services. Next slide. So for the salaries and wages category, it is based on, the budget for that is based on the current staffing level of a total of 115 full-time equivalents. We're not assuming any new positions, and I'd just like to note also that we've remained at that same level for the last 2 years. So this is going into the third year at 115 full-time equivalents. Some of the notable changes here that the growth rate is based on includes the cost of living adjustment for all labor groups, that's 4%, and that is based on the labor agreements that are in place. There are also market equity adjustments for several classifications based on the last compensation study that was conducted, and also in agreement with the labor agreements that we have in place as well for various classifications that were paid under market. And overall, we're assuming a 6% increase. Next slide. For benefits, this category includes our retirement and other benefits, including our medical, dental, and workers' compensation. The fiscal year 2024-25 baseline budget assumes a 21% growth rate, so this is where we're seeing the highest increase from the current year to next year. The CalPERS contribution increased by 16%, so there's a significant increase from last year, and that is mostly due to the investment losses experienced by the system. And then health insurance increased by 8%, so that is included in that growth rate as well. For professional services, this includes all of our consulting and administrative services, our building and equipment maintenance, office supplies, et cetera. And as I mentioned before, it also includes contracts with other governmental agencies, including ComFire and the county animal and library services. We're assuming a 6% growth rate based on those contract obligations. Next is our other operating. So it includes all of our utilities. And we're assuming a 10% growth just based on historical trends, and we're starting to see some increases in our electricity segment in general. Next slide. Materials and supplies includes fuel, maintenance supplies, and safety equipment. So these are all things to support the operating activities of the departments, and we're assuming a 1% growth rate just based on historical trends. And we have realized some savings in this category over the last 3 years. Next slide. Interdepartmental charges include administrative charges and reimbursements for services provided by one city department to another. So for example, our administrative departments are charged out to the other city departments. That would include our legal services, information systems, finance, human resources, and so on. This category also includes general liability insurance, and we're assuming a 2% decrease, a net 2% decrease, because we're expecting the reimbursements to the general fund to be a little bit lower for next year. And capital outlay includes our non-major asset acquisition, so this is separate from the projects that are included in the capital improvement plan. This is non-capitalized equipment, computer equipment and furniture, and we're assuming a 1% increase based on cost estimates provided by the departments. And then we have our next category is debt service. So we have one debt service that is paid by the general fund, and that is for the 2006 pension obligation bonds, and those go through the fiscal year 2035-36. So no change there. It is based on the long-term debt obligation schedule. Next slide. And the last category is the transfers out. That includes the general fund transfer to other funds, the recreation fund and the Pinole Community Television Fund to support their operations. As I mentioned before, they are not able to recover 100% of their cost of providing the various services, and so the general fund does provide an operating subsidy. And the budget assumes no growth consistent with past practice. However, this is an area that we'll bring back to the city council for further review. As the cost in those departments continue to go up, the operating subsidy may need to increase as well. Next slide. So in summary, The draft fiscal year 2024-25 general fund baseline budget is not balanced at this point. We still have some work to do. It does reflect a shortfall of $1.3 million, and staff is working to balance the budget, which will require a total of 6% in reductions. Next slide. So the next steps would be the city council will be hosting a special city council meeting on April 30th, or a budget workshop, and will present basically the same information that you've heard to the full council. We'll also receive council member requests for any additions, deletions. We'll review the one-time request as well. And the goal is to present a balanced budget or balanced baseline budget in the form of the preliminary proposed budget on May 21st. And that concludes my presentation.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any questions or comments?
Thanks for your presentation.
You're welcome.
One thing I want to focus on is, let's see, it's page 65. So the elected roles departments for city council, there was 8% increase and a 14% increase in the city treasurer's office between what was fiscal year 23 baseline and 24-25 baseline. What could that be?
So there weren't really any changes to operations. It's the CalPERS contribution. So you'll see that flow throughout all of the departments where it appears that their operating expenditures may be significantly higher in some cases, but it's due to the CalPERS contribution.
Gotcha. But not all folks from those departments are using those benefits.
Yes, it's the retirement benefits that the city the city is required to contribute to. Yeah.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. The only question that I have is, where are we on the quarterly updates? Have you taken it through March 30th yet? I don't think we've seen that. And will we see that? When will we see that within the next few months?
You'll see that in May.
Okay.
Yes, so mid-year was the last report. That was the
Right.
second quarter, yes.
Right, so we'll have a good picture of 75% of this fiscal year.
Yes, you will.
Okay, I don't have any other questions. I do have a comment from Rafael Menace.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Hello again. So, folks can still hear me, right?
We can hear you, yes.
Great. So there's a few comments I wanted to make on this particular one. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can pull the relevant segments up in the agenda packet. First off, I believe this was the area where we were considering basically what the impact of going for a bond measure for road repairs was, although maybe that was the prior one.
That was
I don't know.
probably the prior one.
Okay, so I'll set that aside. That's a comment for a later time then. I guess my first question is sort of a follow-up to my question in the prior one. What does a 6% across the board budget cut look like in practical terms? Is it just a flat salary reduction? Is it the cancellation of salary increases? Is it an increase? Well, I'm assuming it's not an increase in proportions paid because that would require being confirmed. That would probably be longer than the current time cycle for passing the current fiscal year budget. I guess my second question is, does the city expect this issue with the CalPERS budget to recur in the next fiscal year? And then, sorry, having to look at all of this in a mobile UI, so it's a little bit trickier. I guess looping back, I'm assuming that this is not including the proposed economic development director position that was sort of indirectly discussed at the city council meeting on Tuesday with regards to the whole economic development package. If that was added in, what would be the, roughly speaking, fiscal impact of adding in that level position? And I think those are all my questions for now. I'm sure I'll have more, but I didn't think of at the moment. But for right now, that'll do.
Okay, are you able to address that, or do you want to take note and?
I can address it.
Address it, okay, thank you.
Sure. So the first question regarding the 6% reduction, number one, for the labor agreements, those are locked in. They expire June 30, 2025. So we are looking at non-personnel reductions at the department level. So the next largest category, of course, we're really looking at the professional services category for all departments and kind of prioritizing activities. So looking at essential versus non-essential items in terms of priorities or things that can be deferred until the situation is better. So that has been a direction so far. There's no direction to make any changes to personnel at this time. So we're just looking at all of the other areas and looking at the most critical items. I mean, we have contracts, as I mentioned, with other governmental agencies. Not much we can really do about those, right? So, but for some other consulting contracts that we may have, we're taking a look at those and looking at other operating costs, whether travel, training, some of the lower hanging fruit. So we're looking at those as well.
Okay, thank you for that.
And then,
Oh, go ahead.
okay. Did you have a comment on
no.
that one first?
No.
Okay. And then for the next question, does the city expect the CalPERS issue to continue beyond next year? That is hard to say. So based on the projections that we do have now, because PERS does provide a 5-year projection in all of the valuation reports, no, it's projected to smooth out beyond fiscal year, so the next fiscal year, which would be 25-26. However, it's based on their the investment or the market, right, for the investments. So if there's a better investment year, it could go down, it could stay the same. If we experience the same investment losses as the previous year, then it could actually increase even more. So it's very hard to say. We can only use the assumptions that we have before us now. And for fiscal year 25-26, based on the projections that we have now, the increase is not as significant as it is for this upcoming fiscal year. And then lastly, the budget does not include the economic development position, economic development manager position at this time, but we do have the figure on what the fiscal impact would be. So we could provide that later, but it's not included.
Okay, thank you. Any closing comments, questions? Thank you for all of this work. I know this is a really heavy lift every year, and we do appreciate it. All the work that all of the department heads do as well. So thank you, and let me get back to my agenda. I believe we're ready to adjourn, and we will be meeting on April 30th. Thank you all.